Namaste and welcome to Detours with me, Anuradha Goyal, where I talk to some very interesting personalities about journeys of all kinds. Namaste and welcome to Detours. Today we have a guest who's the first of his kind on Detours. We've never had a musician on Detours. So I'm very happy that we have G Ravikiran ji, who is a musician and a very, very specialist musician in Carnatic music. And he is working towards preservation and propagation of the works of Muthuswamy Dikshitar, who was a 18th, 19th century poet saint musician. Probably people in the Tamil country know a lot about him, but outside of that, I was also not too much aware of his works till I visited some of the temples in the regions that he speaks about. So I am very curious. So this is a subject I know very less about. So I am very curious to learn about Muthuswamy Dikshitar ji and the work Sri Ravi ji is doing. So Ravi ji, welcome to Detours. And first of all, introduce us to yourself. How did you get attracted to Muthuswamy Dikshitar ji?
Thank you so much, Anuradhaji, for having me over, and hello to all your listeners. It's great to be part of the tours with you, and let's hope this is an exciting detour of the of the main track. So thanks for having me over. Muthuswamy Dikshitar has been a presence, if you would call that, in my musical journey for the last 25 years. All students of music learn his compositions. Within the world of Carnatic music, there are three main, if you may call that, composers. There is Tyagaraja, there is Muthuswamy Dikshitar, and Shama Shastri. Similar to, say, Western music, where you had Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. Somewhere during the same time in the southern part of India, there was a musical revolution within the Carnatic music, the South Indian music idiom. So Muthuswamy Dikshitar is one such composer, and his contribution to Carnatic music has been enormous. So we can talk about it later. But, it's an organic process, right? There's never one moment when you get drawn to it. Yes, there is love at first sight, and you listen to his composition, and there's always been that special sound that I'd always admired, without probably being aware of it. But as you become more, it draws you to it, and by the time you know it, you're head over heels in love with Dikshitar.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it's been, right? And that's the case with me as well. So started learning a few compositions. Looking back now, I realized that probably ended up singing Dikshitar's compositions a bit more than the others, just out of sheer, just
And
because
it
you're
grew
drawn to it.
from there.
It grew from there, and it also helped that two of my gurus, Padma Bhushan Awardee Sangeeta Kalanidhi, Dr. R.K. Srikantan sir and Sri T.M. Krishna sir, now, both have been very instrumental in nurturing this, because both of them have been equally passionate about Dikshitar's composition. So they fostered that fire and fostered that urge that I had, and somewhere I learned a lot, and I've been learning a lot.
Okay, so for a layperson who is not aware or who's not fortunate enough to know about Muthuswamy Dikshitar ji, please introduce him to us.
I've never done this. Where do I
So
begin?
where was he born? Which timeline did he live in, and how did he become a musical chief?
Wonderful, sure. It's my pleasure. Muthuswamy Dikshitar was born in the late 18th century, so 1775, and he lived up to 1835. So he lived for 60 years, which I guess was typical, the lifespan around that time. In these 60 years, he's had a phenomenal. He was born in Tiruvarur, called Tiruvarur, which is famous for, you would know, I'm sure, which is famous for the Tyagaraja temple. And the Tyagaraja temple is, I mean, we should talk about that on some other occasion, but that's such a central presence also in the life of Muthuswamy Dikshitar and his family. So, Dikshitar's father was closely involved in the temple of Tiruvaru, with the temple of Tiruvaru. When the temple, when there used to be the temple procession or the Utsavam for Tyagaraja, Lord Tyagaraja of Tiruvaru, the deity is carried around the temple on a particular route, and you have the Nagaswara Vidvans, the Nadaswaram, right? Nadaswaram or Nagaswaram, it's called by both the names, who play all along the way. And Ramaswamy Dikshitar, who's Muthuswamy Dikshitar's father. So Muthuswamy Dikshitar's father played a great role in documenting what the Nadaswara Vidwans are supposed to play where.
Okay.
So which is followed even till date in the temple.
Okay.
That you come here and then you play these particular pieces. At this point in the procession, then when the procession moves here, you have to play. As it moves here, you have to play this. When it goes here, you have to play this. It's
like
a
an
long.
SOP.
Yes, actually, yes. He laid it down, and it's followed till today. So Dikshitar and his family were. When I say Dikshitar, I'm Dikshitar. So Muthuswamy and young Muthuswamy were always closely associated with the Tiruvarur temple. And there's a very interesting Sanskrit saying around Tiruvarur. Tiruvarur is also known as Kamalalayam. And the temple tank, which is one of the largest temple tanks in the world of Tiruvarur, is known as the Kamalalayam or Kamalalaya Tirtham. Now, there's a Sanskrit old saying which says, Jananath Kamalalaye, and it goes on multiple lines, but the summary is that it says anybody who's born in Tiruvarur, anybody who thinks of Arunachala, anybody who sees Chidambaram, and anybody who sheds his mortal coil in Kashi, even if you do one of these, you attain salvation, they say.
I've done 2 of them.
Wonderful.
3 of them, actually.
You've insured yourself 3 times over. There's no other. There's no way out. So and Tyagaraja, Dikshitar, and Shama Shastri were all born in Tiruvarur, incidentally.
Right.
So anyway, so coming back, so Dikshitar was born in Tiruvarur, spent a few early years there, and then in those days you had patrons, right? And this was the late 18th century. So you had the British already in India, and you had what we used to call Dubashis or Vibhashis that became later.
Yeah.
Right. So some of these the patrons also served the British Empire in various capacities.
Right.
So there is a place called Manali, very close to Chennai, not Manali, but Manali here, down south, very close to Chennai, where there lived a Mudaliar. And when he visited Tiruvarur, he heard so much about Dikshitar's father and he heard him sing and all that, that he requested him to come with his family to Manali.
Okay.
Young Muthuswamy from Tiruvarur with his siblings. He had 2 brothers and sister. So all 4 of them with their father and mother traveled to Manali near Chennai and settled down there. When he's 14 years old, I'm telling you the abridged version of his story.
Right.
Feel free to, we can expand on any part later. When he was 14 years old, a yogi, Paranath yogi, visits Manali, and his father takes care of him, and the Mudaliar takes care of him, and all that. And this Chidambaranath yogi senses that there is something special about young Muthuswamy, a young 14-year-old Muthuswamy. And by then, young Muthuswamy is already, those days, in certain communities, one would automatically Sanskrit, Vedas, music, arts, mythology, all by the time one is 14 or 16, you have studied all. This is like basic, it's like the CBSE class 10 syllabus, right? You finish all this.
Right.
And they studied with depth.
Okay.
So young Muthuswamy is also adept at all that. And Chidambaranath yogi senses that there is something special about this young Muthuswamy. And he asks his father whether he could take him along with him to Kashi. Now remember, we are talking about late 18th century, probably 1780s, 1790s, when travel to Kashi was deemed as something you do and you never come back, right? It was the long and arduous journey. So Ramaswamy Dikshitar agrees with great hesitation, but young Muthuswamy travels with Chidambaranath yogi to Kashi, stays there for 5 years, and After 5 years, his guru calls him and says, "You're ready to leave."
Mm.
There are some episodes that one finds in latter day books about Muthuswamy Dikshitar finding a Veena of the Ghats of Kashi and how it triggered his musical journey and all that. But just sticking to the biographical details alone, he spent his 4 or 5 years in Kashi. Then he travels back home and he visits a place called Tiruttani. Tiruttani is one of the six abodes of Muruga. It's called the Arupade. So he visits Tiruttani, and it is said that in Tiruttani he composed his first composition. So when he was probably around 19 or 20, we can assume between 18 or 20, right? He's said to have composed his very first composition in Sanskrit.
Mm-hmm.
And since then he traveled extensively. He was what we call an eternal pilgrim. He traveled all his life, and he kept composing compositions attributed to these kshetras that he visited.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we get edifices which are not only the temples that he talks about or the kshetras and the gopurams, but also the gopurams and kshetras of ragas and rag devtas and the music that we get. So this is in summary. And then towards the end of his life, he visits a place called Ettayapuram, which is near Tirunelveli,
Mm-hmm.
down south in Tamil Nadu, where the Raja of Ettayapuram was his patrons. And it is there that he spends his last few years.
Mm-hmm.
He comes there to attend the coronation of the younger Maharaja of Ettayapuram. But he stays back knowing that his time is up. He spends the last few years in Ettayapuram. And I get goosebumps talking to you about this, but it's such a divine coincidence that around Diwali day, he shed his mortal life. I don't know how this happened, but we are talking a week before Diwali today. We are recording this on the week before Diwali, but
yes. So I know that
so
it
that's his.
you know
He died on 1835 on the day before Diwali, as we celebrated.
right. So these are not coincidences. I've had so many of them that I know that some he probably wants us to talk. That's why we are talking. So it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So very interesting that you mentioned that he wrote primarily in Sanskrit. Going by today's time, it looks very difficult to say that somebody who was was from the Tamil country and lived all his life in more or less all his life there, barring the 5 years he spent in Kashi, would choose to write in Sanskrit. So, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, it's a very complex
Mm-hmm.
observation there because Sanskrit or Sanskrit has always been the chosen language for a lot of poets south
Mm-hmm.
of the Vindhyas. Right? If
Mm-hmm.
you write, even if you go slightly up, even to Jayadeva's time
Right.
or Narayana Tirtha's time down south, so Sanskrit has always been an integral part of literature and of definitely one of the chosen languages.
Mm-hmm.
Dikshitar was inculcated into Sri Vidya, which is a tantric form of worship of Devi in her various forms. He was called Chidanandanatha. That was his namkaran that they do after you take Diksha. So after he took Diksha, he received a Diksha Nama called Chidanandanatha. So automatically there is definitely a draw towards Sanskrit and to the whole concept of Devi and the divine goddess in various forms. So that is definitely one factor. The other, incidentally, about not composing in Tamil is that in the Tanjavur belt, especially, Telugu was one of the most preferred languages. In fact, Telugu was also one of the court languages. So
Right.
much so
Mm-hmm.
that the musical treatises written by the Tanjavur kings,
Mm-hmm.
right, whether it is Shahaji or Tulaja in the 17th and 18th centuries,
Mm-hmm.
are all in Telugu. Raga
Okay.
Lakshanamu is in
Mm-hmm.
Telugu. Telugu was considered a poetic language, and
Okay.
it was also one of the official languages down
Mm-hmm.
south. There are many
Mm-hmm.
reasons for it, but you could trace it back to multiple reasons. But summary is that Telugu was actually one of the more predominant languages in as
Okay.
far as composing or writing literature or compositions in Carnatic music is concerned. So much so that even the Tyagaraja, who was, of course, a Telugu by birth, but grew up completely in present day Tamil Nadu, composed entirely in Telugu. Whereas his signature, found in one of the libraries, has his signature as Tyagayar, which is more of a Tamil honorific. So, yeah. But anyway, so these two could be the reasons.
Okay. So this tells me two things. One, that Muthuswami lived, like, say, about 200 years ago. So till about 200 years ago, Sanskrit was a prevalent language of the learned people. That's one thing. And a second, he may also have written in Sanskrit because he wanted a larger audience to read it or sing it. Because Sanskrit obviously was pretty much pan-India, or pan-Indian subcontinent of today, which was understood. That could have been one of the reasons. I don't know if that is.
It's tough to say that today, honestly, because Purandaradasa, who was a 12th century composer of Carnatic music and who is considered the father of Carnatic music today, is called the Sangeeta Pitamaha, because he documented the beginner's lessons of Carnatic music that are followed even today, composed in Kannada. And we have hundreds and thousands of his compositions that are even sung today. And they're all in Kannada. There are a few in Sanskrit as well, but it's predominantly Kannada. So, and his compositions had a wide reach. So, I would not, I think I would attribute it to the fact that that was his ecosystem.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Dikshitar was in that ecosystem, and that is his world. I would be curious to know about that world without judging him for that world.
No, we're not getting
I'm just
at all.
No.
Another thing, you mentioned signature. Now, your channel is also called GuruGuha Amritam, and GuruGuha is the signature that Dikshitar used. So, tell us some anecdotes about it. How did he get it?
GuruGuha. So our the movement that I run is called GuruGuha Amrita. So it's GuruGuha plus Amrit becomes GuruGuha Amrita, the nectar of GuruGuha. Now, what is GuruGuha? Superficially, GuruGuha is the signature that Muthuswamy Dikshitar used in all his compositions. GuruGuha is also the name of Lord Subramanya or Muruga, and Dikshitar's first was in Tirutani, which was again very closely associated with Subramanya. So there is a very close tie-up, superficial. Look at the word GuruGuha. It could be Muthuswamy, Dikshitar, his compositions, but the word, of course, has multitude of interpretations. You would know better. Guru itself is such a powerful word because it's a dispeller of darkness. Who dispels andhakar, who dispels darkness is Guru.
Right.
So the concept of Guru itself was very central to Muthuswamy Dikshitar because that part of his compositions, all a good number of them, close to 6 to 7 of his initial compositions, were all around the notion of Guru. And he composed in all the Sanskrit vibhaktis for Guru. So in Sanskrit, you have vibhaktis, Prathama vibhakti, Dvitiya vibhakti, Tritiya vibhakti, which show the relation between the subject and the object, right? So he composed many compositions which were different usages or different vibhaktis of Guru. So the concept of Guru itself was very sacred to Muthuswamy Dikshitar, and he used that in his music and his and the text.
So GuruGuha, as a very lay person, meaning would be the cave of Guru. Guha means
you could say that.
Yeah. So, but you it's interesting that you say that it's actually associated with Subramanya or Kartik.
It is said to be another name of Lord Subramanya or Lord Kartikeya down south.
But so it's very, very interesting. Now, you said that he was an eternal pilgrim. He traveled extensively. So tell us about his travels, which parts he traveled, and what did he do? If we know anything about his travels, what did he do on his travels? How did he travel?
Sure. So First of all, there are two aspects to it. One is we need to understand the time and age that he lived in, which
Mhm.
is, again, like I said, late 18th century, early 19th century, right? He passed away in 1835 when he was 60 years old. And considering life expectancy around that time, you can make out that probably in the last 5, 6 years, he would probably not have traveled much in those days of age.
Right.
He lived in Tiruvarur, Manali, and Ettayapuram.
Mhm.
Tiruvarur is in, again, closer to the coast
Mhm.
of the Bay Bengal, a little further away from Nagapattinam, present day Nagapattinam. Uh, Manali is slightly up north, closer to Chennai, and Ettayapuram is in Tirunelveli district near Tuticorin,
Down south.
right down south again. These three were the main hubs, if you may call it that.
Mhm.
And these three have been hubs around which his travels took him. His very first, I like the phrase eternal pilgrim because the very first composition, in fact, even before he started composing, he traveled to Kashi, which is, if you look at it, right, for a 14-year-old in late 18th century, I mean, even today we would think twice before sending our children alone with a stranger to
Right.
Banaras, right?
Mhm.
Even if it were to be just get onto a flight here and land in Banaras,
Right.
right? But so his life has been molded by the travels and by he made, right? And one can expect that one can probably definitely anticipate and extrapolate that had an impact on his personality. Because the more you travel, the more you learn so
Biggest
much.
university. It's the biggest
Biggest
university
university,
of the world. But
right?
I mean, I'm just interjecting that it was not so uncommon. Remember centuries before that, Adi Shankaracharya traveled from Kerala across the world, and every saint in India they traveled. So I think
Yes,
we are living in the times when we are far more scared than our earlier generations were.
definitely, definitely. And if you recollect, we always say they traveled, they never arrived. They traveled
Yes,
and they kept traveling, and one can only guess and one can only infer that the travel itself was the bigger part, both from a time perspective as well as from a learning perspective. It's a journey
yes,
that I'm sure would have opened up all their minds and creative space. So coming back to Dikshitar, that was his. So even before he started composing in Carnatic music, he had traveled to Kashi and back. Then he comes to Tirthani and he composes his very first composition, which is a very complex musical piece. I mean, you can talk for hours on just that his first composition itself, and the bar of composing is set so high by his first composition that you wonder if this was the first, then what was inside his head, right? Which is true of a lot of geniuses, right? The first
right.
works you make out, my God, I mean, this is the starting point. So from Tirutani, he travels. It is said that he traveled around in and around that belt, which would be present day in and around present day Chennai, say 100 miles, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers in and around Chennai. He predominantly went to Kanchipuram around that time, and he composed compositions around that. Now, there is a theory that I learned from a good friend of mine who's an expert on these aspects, that it is said that in one particular form of Sri Vidya worship, and in fact, we have captured this in one of our episodes of Dikshita Kshetra Darshanam that we produced. So I'm quoting Sri Madhusudan Kalachalvan, who's my collaborator in the Dikshita Kshetra Darshanam project that we've been producing. It is said that in a Dikshitar was a Sri Vidya worshipper. Sri Vidya, he was
Faster.
indoctrinated into the Sri Vidya Upasana. So he was an Upasak. And it is said that there are many branches of Sri Vidya worship. I know we can go there some other time. There's only so much that you can talk about without being indoctrinated yourself. So there's a limit on how much you can talk about, right? It is said that in one of the branches of Sri Vidya Upasana, it is part of the Upasana to visit a kshetra, come back, and have kind of an outpouring about the kshetra to
Mhm.
the Devi or via composition or writing about it or talking about it.
Mhm.
So it could be that is also a factor that in Dikshitar's ecosystem because he was a Sri Vidya Upasaka and he visited these kshetras, and there is almost an innate urge in him to share that. Right? So he visits these kshetras. Each of these kshetras with a lot of detail. There are some compositions which are down to the last detail about what kind of tower, how many prakarams, or the periphery, how many rounds you can go, which is the main deity, which is the main deity, which is the consort, what are the Sthala Puranams, the local legends. So he talks about each of this. So he goes to Kanchipuram, then he's traveled in and around present day Chennai, like I said. The other belt is in and around present day Tiruvarur. So that would be, and you would be surprised that a lot of kshetras that he writes about are so-called small kshetras sometimes. That today you would go to the kshetras and you would feel that hardly anybody visits these kshetras. So it could be due to two reasons. It could be due to the fact that they could have been more popular or touristy back then, or and also secondly because they have been very poorly maintained today, and some of the kshetras are in pretty bad shape today.
Kshetras
Anyway.
also have a cycle, they go up and down. So it
Okay,
depends on the
makes sense.
energy, So some kshetras, you have to constantly charge the energy of the kshetra. So if the energy has not been charged enough, they tend to go down, and then somebody would come and recharge and take them up. So they go through this cycle.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, so they went through. So he travels in and around Tiruvarur. Now we should, like I said, we should put an element of the time and age. Even to travel, say, 50 kilometers to a kshetra would have been probably a 3-day journey in his time.
Right.
So he traveled extensively around the Tiruvarur belt. You'll find small kshetras, so-called small kshetras, from a Sikh point of view. It's a temple with one sannidhi. For example, let's say Nida Mangalam. Nida Mangalam is a small sannidhi of the Tiruvarur, near Tiruvarur. Or even kshetras like Tiruppanna Mangai, which is again near Tiruvarur, are not very busy today. Right? They are very important kshetras locally, but they're not big from a size and visit a number of tourists. So he traveled around the Tiruvarur belt. That's our second focal point. The third focal point is, interestingly, not much of composition happened in and around the Etiyapuram belt. Probably because by the time he went there, he goes there twice during his lifetime, but the second time he was aged. So one can assume that he probably did not have the physical energy to travel too much. So his travel, as documented in his compositions, are centered around the Tiruvarur belt, Tiruvarur Tanjavur belt, the Kaveri Delta basically, and the Manali, in and around Chennai belt. There are compositions outside of this where he attributes a particular composition to a particular deity. Let us say it could be Tirupati, or Tirupati again. Tirupati is again very close to in the Chennai belt, right? Because present day Chennai to Tirupati is 3-4 hours. You could imagine that it was accessible even back then. But he also composes some kshetras that he probably might not have visited himself, but he attributes it to that, saying, I surrender this composition to such and such a deity of such and such a kshetra. So he traveled pretty much in these 2-3 belts.
So you mentioned that he describes the temples and the deities, of course, in great detail. So can you take us to one example of one temple and how it is documented or chronicled or glorified in his works?
Sure. So now, kshetra, right? So there are many aspects to a kshetra. That's why we need to be conscious about using the right terms, because temple is a very restrictive term, right? Like you rightly mentioned.
Yeah.
Kshetras are all encompassing, and the reason is there's an academic reason to it. It's not just a personal reason. A kshetra, by definition, is defined by many attributes. The 7 that I am aware of, at least, are Vimana. Vimana, for those who are listening in, Vimana is the Shikha on top of the
Superstructure.
The superstructure on top of the Garbhagriha, the Sanctum Sanctorum, above that. So the Vimana, the Mantapa, Mandap, Aranya, or the forest near in and around the temple, Tirtha, or the water body, right? The Kshetra itself, river, Nadi,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And Sthalam, or the town. So these 7 elements are what we largely associated with kshetras. So there are some kshetras which have all of these 7 elements. There are some kshetras which might have some of them. There might have some which have few, 3, 4. Some of them will have 5. Some of them will have all 7. The kshetras that have all 7 are called Saptamrita kshetras. The Saptamrita kshetrams, because they have 7 elements: Vimana, Mandapa. So Vimanam, Mandapam, Aranyam, Kshetram itself, Tirtham, Nadi, and the Sthalam, the town. So these attributes are what collectively, and Dikshitar, being a very academic and scholarly person, going by his compositions, and is going by his family background. I mean, that's a different thing. I mean, because his family also has a very academic bent of mind. His father was the one who discovered the raga Hamsadhvani that is sung even today. Hamsadhvani is a raga that traveled from Carnatic music into Hindustani music as well, and it's sung even widely today. So he comes from a family of thinkers, scholars, very devout academicians, right, in today's parlance. And Dikshitar approached kshetras also in a very structured, academic, scholarly manner. There are if you look at his compositions attributed to kshetras, there are one category where he attributes it, saying, through this composition I worship so and so god who resides in so and so kshetra, and he leaves it at that. Now I'm not talking of musicality. Musically all of them are rich in their own ways, right? But from a textual point of view. So that is one category where there's a kind of a superficial, there's attribution, and they say, okay, I worship so and so. The second category, which is a subset of this, is where he goes into the intricacies of the kshetras. Presumably, one can only presume that the second category are the kshetras that he probably visited himself. And the first category is probably kshetras which he has heard about and he's read about, and through second person, third person accounts. So when we come to the second category of kshetras that he probably visited, I remember I mentioned Vimanam, Mandapam, Aranyam, Tirtham, Kshetram, Nadi, Sthalam. Dikshitar methodically talks about each of these in his composition. So I'll take one example, which is one of my favorite examples, which was the very first episode of Dikshitar Kshetra Darshan that we did on a place called Tirukkandu Mangai, near Tiruvarur, present-day Tiruvarur. It's a half an hour drive from Tiruvarur today. It's also one of the 108 Divya Desams that are documented in Vaishnava literature. And this place is one of those kshetras and also one of those compositions. Dikshitar has composed a composition on this, where he talks about each of these attributes. So, for example, Vimanam. Dikshitar mentions in his composition that the one part of the composition comes like this. Shashanka Guru Talpa Dosha Hara Darsha Pushkarani Tata Paschima Bhaga Sushobhitotpalavadaka Sthitam Suramaya Madhumakshikaradhitam Bhaktavatsala. Bhaktavatsala Perumal is the name of the deity here. Bhaktavatsala. So he says that. So that is the. And sorry, coming back to the line that I sang. He says, Shanka Guru Talpa Dosha Hara Darsha Pushkarani Tata Paschima Bhaka Sushobhitotpalavaka Sthitam. Utpalavaka Vimana is a type of Vimana. There is Para Vimana, there is Utpalavaka Vimana, there are many types of Vimana. So Utpalavaka Vimana refers to Vimana which looks like an inverted lily. And
Utpala is lotus.
Utpala, yeah. So the Utpalavaka style of composing attributes to the inverted, the shape of the Vimana above the Mula Sannidhi, right? So we find the reference. So Utpala, so it's documented that Bhaktavatsala temple, Tirukanamangai temple, has an Utpala Vimana documented. Now, even if you go to the temple today, you will find the priests inside recite all this in their shlokas in different forms. Okay? So we find through this composition we know that the temple has a Utpalavaka Vimana. Second, he says Darsha Pushkarani Tata. The name of the Pushkarani or the Tirtha is called Darsha Pushkarani. So he refers to the Pushkarani. Then through the rest of the composition, he talks about the mandapa that is there. It's called Dashakritiam Krishna Mangala Kshetrapatim. He says a reference to the name of the Kshetra, Krishna Mangala Kshetra. That's the name of the Kshetra. Lakshmi Vivahotsavam. The place where Lakshmi got married, he says.
Yeah, or where the festival Utsav of Lakshmi Vivaha is celebrated.
Happened with Lakshmi Vivaha Utsavam. Vishala Veda Sagara Mandapam, he says. And the name of the mandap that is there in this temple, even today, is called the Veda Sagara Mandapam, the ocean of Vedas. It's called the mandap itself is called the Veda Sagara Mandap. So you find a reference to the Vimana, the mandap, the Aranyam. In this composition, you will find Tirtha Darsha Pushkarani. Kshetra, he says, this is Bhaktavatsala Kshetram. Krishna Mangala Kshetram. Right? So,
is there a river there?
There is a river, of course. He talks about Darsha Pushkarini. That refers to the Tirtha and the river, both. The river doesn't run by Tirukanamangai, so he probably doesn't refer to the river here because by the river, by the temple, there is no river that runs. It runs a little further away. So he refers to Tirtha here, which is Pushkarini, or Tirtha or Pushkarini, which is Darsha Pushkarini. And then refers to the town, Krishna Mangala Kshetram and the temple. So, but for this composition, a student of music would not be able to be aware of the fact that this wonderful musically rich composition in a rag called Vamsha, which by itself is a fascinating rag and which is a very fascinating composition, is also a route into the architectural, historical, and mythological legacy that this kshetra represents. Right? There is also not just this. Dikshitar also talks about the Sthala Purana, the local legends of the kshetra. He says Shashanka Guru Talpa Dosha Hara. So there is a famous story for those of them, those audience who's listening. There is a legend of how Guru Brihaspati and the moon. There was a dispute, and the moon went into hiding, and it is said that the moon, Shashank, as he is called in Sanskrit, the moon got rid of his dosham or the dosh by taking a dip in this temple. And it is celebrated even today. So these compositions served as almost like a portal to all these aspects.
Right.
There are many examples that I can highlight. I mean, go on and on, but so this is one example.
This is more or like the Sthala Puranas, or a Kshetra Mahatmya, as we call it.
Also, yeah.
So you rightly described those 7 elements of a kshetra. Then every kshetra has these stories associated, Puranic stories associated with them. They also have a record of the previous travelers, that who traveled here before and who wrote about it. So, for example, if you are traveling today and you write a composition, you say, Dikshitar also came here. Okay. So, so this is a format, and interestingly, as I'm recording these conversations with a lot of people, I'm discovering that most of our kshetras had this. I would say they evoked these emotions in the bhaktas that they composed. So, for example, Jagannath Puri. There is this whole genre of paintings and songs which describe the journey to Jagannath Puri. They describe
Mm.
everything, that when you reach here, you'll be able to see the flag. When you reach here, you'll cross this bridge, you will see this, then you will see this. So the pilgrim is actually living that journey. So, but incidentally, these are not documented. So we're making this small effort to document all of this. Um,
Absolutely, and the extent to which the document is phenomenal. Uh, in this composition that I just talked to you about, in the portion that I sang, in fact, itself, he says, Suramaya Madhumakshikaradhitam.
mm,
So it says, the Suras, the gods who came to attend Lakshmi's wedding,
mm,
Lakshmi and Vishnu's
Vishnu.
wedding, they were so enamored by this whole kshetra that was there, called
Mm,
Tirukkannamangalam, that they did not have the heart to leave the place, apparently. So they decided to stay back. And how did they stay back? They stayed back as honeybees. Suramaya Madhumakshikaradhitam. And
right,
one who is worshipped by the honeybees, which are actually suras or gods,
right,
celestial beings, rather.
right.
And even today, if you were to go to Krishna Mangala Kshetram, Tirukkannamangai, in the in the temple assigned to the consort, uh, the Devi there, you will find
Mm,
Abhishekavalli is her name.
mm,
You will find the honeybee. You can see the honeybee, and there is a puja that happens to the honeybee
mm,
periodically as well.
mm.
So it's a very intricate, complex interplay of mythology, nature, geography, music. I mean,
Aesthetics.
it's it's a it's a very complex mix. It's
It's
very nuanced.
beautifully bringing together all the elements that form life.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that's very interesting. Now, one another thing that my readings of little bit of Muthuswamy Dikshitar tell me is that, and that's why I think he was a pilgrim or a traveler first than everything else, is that he wrote about almost all deities. When we look at bhakti poets, they typically tend to be inclined towards one deity, their ishta. So if it's Tulsidas, it will be Hanuman and Ram. If it's Surdas, it will be Krishna. If it is, then there are people who write on, Tukaram, so they'll write on Vitthal Das. So they all had a chosen Ishta Devata. While Muthuswamy Dikshitar, it seems he wrote about almost all the deities that he visited. Is
Right.
that right?
So that's fair to say. Yes, because you can find so five broad streams you find, right? There is Shaiva, there
Mm-hmm.
is Shakta, there is
Mm-hmm.
Vaishnava, there is
Ganpatya.
Saura, there is Ganapatya, right? So these five,
Mm-hmm.
Shaiva on Shiva, Ganapatya on Ganapati, Shakti,
Mm-hmm.
the Shakta tradition on Shakti,
Mm-hmm.
Vaishnava on Vishnu, Saura on Surya,
Right.
right? And you find dictionary positions across these belt,
Yes.
across all these five streams. I would definitely say, because it was a Sri Vidyopasaka, one does find fair number of compositions on the Shakta, uh,
Okay.
in the Shakta
What
stream, definitely.
percentage would it be like of all his works, roughly?
Honestly, I've not counted that, so I would not want to comment. But we would find empirically, I have observed there is a bit more on the Shakta side. But I think that's it's a good number to have to count and document.
I'm assuming some PhD scholar would have done that already
They
somewhere.
all, I'm sure they've already done that. But one thing I personally try and focus, because I come from musical perspective, so I tend to focus more on the kind of rags that he handled, the kind of approach he took musically. But yeah, definitely somebody
So
inclined towards that
a very
should pursue.
layperson, a very, very layperson question. Uh, all the musical compositions that he did, are we still, do you still sing it the same way that he composed? Or most musicians
It's
today?
a very interesting question. Very interesting question you asked, Anuradha, because that is part of the effort that GuruGuha Amrita has been creating more awareness about. Dikshitar, so Tyagaraja and Dikshitar were two of the most prolific composers in terms of the number of compositions. Tyagaraja had a different ecosystem. He had a lot of disciples who in turn had many disciples, who in turn had many disciples. So it's not uncommon for any musician, Carnatic musician today, to be able to trace a learning lineage all the way to Tyagaraja. Almost all of us can trace a learning lineage which can go back to Tyagaraja himself, even Tyagaraja died in 1847. However, in the case of Muthuswamy, probably because of his schooling, probably because of his mindset, but whatever it could be, one does not find as many disciples or as many leaders uh, as Tyagaraja. There is a good side to it and a bad side to it, right? The good side to it is, I mean, this is just my perspective. The good part of it is the available documentation of Muthuswamy Dikshitar's compositions, and there are few, and one of the most authentic ones was published in 1904 by his adopted grandson, you know, if you want to call it, by his brother's adopted grandson. So his brother adopted his grandson as his son because he did not have male heir and all that. So practically, Dikshitar's grandson was Subbarama Dikshitar in a way. And Subbarama Dikshitar documented a work called Sangeet Sampradaya Pradarshini in 1904. In fact, Subbarama Dikshitar and Bhatkande had an interesting set of conversations. And Bhatkande was greatly influenced by those conversations. And it's documented in Bhatkande's works. That's a different conversation altogether. But coming back to this, so Subbarama Dikshitar documents what is presumably the most authentic notation of around 229 of Dikshitar's compositions. There are a couple more that are available in other sources, but this by far is supposed to be the most authentic one. Do we sing it the same way today? There are two aspects to this. One, does any composition have to be sung the same way that it's been composed? That's the first question I would ask. And that's a very complex question because even let's take even a present day example. If you were to hear the present day, say, if you take a popular music, a film song, if you were to hear the music director of the film song sing that song as he taught it to a musician, as he taught it to a playback singer, and the way the singer would sing it, there would be a world of difference. So even at that instance of a music director composing and a singer singing, the music evolves or transforms itself. So should it be sung the same way? It's a complex question. We can talk about it. And that's a more nuanced argument. But the second question is what I am more personally passionate about, which is, are we following the Raga tradition or the Raga Sampradaya that Muthuswamy Dikshitar followed? And the Raga Sampradaya that Dikshitar followed traces its origin to Venkatamakin and the Raga Sampradaya that Venkatamakin, who is considered one of the scholars of Indian classical music, documented. And unfortunately, that is not the case today. A lot of ragas have been homogenized. By homogenized, I mean that Tyagaraja is said to have followed a different system. Dikshitar is said to have followed a different raga system. Both these systems trace their origin to the same parent system, but they have different branches. And they're unique in their own ways. But today, in today's context, by today, I would mean even in the last 50, 60 years, these have been homogenized, which means you take composition in a particular rag that Dikshitar composed, but you interpret it or reinterpret it in the rag system of, say, Tyagaraja. And then you homogenize this and say, because this is very comfortable for me, because I don't have to worry about two different raga systems. Right? So that is not happening today, and that is something that needs to happen more and more with the help of students and musicians alike.
So my final question to you is, are there some easy to read books or references that people can refer to if they are more curious about Muthuswamy Dikshitar's work? And especially, are his works available in English, Hindi, and the other languages that people want?
Absolutely. I mean, there is an English translation of the Sangeeta Sampradaya Pradarshini,
Okay.
and the Sangeet Sampradaya Pradarshini should be your go-to text to understand the multi-dimensional aspects of these difficulties. It is available in English. It's available online in a website called GuruGuha.org. So if you go to GuruGuha.org and figure it out, there is this downloadable form. As part of this, there's also a text called Vagyakar Charitram that Subramanian Dikshitar wrote. And it documents the lives of 72 composers who Subramanian Dikshitar was aware of. So you get a view, you get short biographical sketches of Muthuswamy Dikshitar, his father, and 70 other composers in this text. So I would advise and I would suggest that this would be a good starting source, and you could find it in guruguha.org, which is run by a few of my friends.
Personally, for me, is there a Sanskrit to Hindi translation of his works, his kritis?
The Sangeet Natak Academy back in, I think, the 70s did publish a series of versions. So there have been publications of the. So if you're looking for a Hindi anwad of the meaning, I need to go back and check.
If it's not there, you have to create it.
We should.
And I'm giving you a wish. So please make it happen.
With God's will, yes. But there is a wonderful publication by an eminent musician of this century called Sri T.K. Govindarao, who's no longer with us, Sangeeta Kalanidhi T.K. Govindarao, who published an archival of many Dikshitar compositions along with the English translation of their meaning, word-to-word meaning. So it's available, and please look it up. It's available in a lot of online stores as well. It's called, it's by T.K. Govindarao, and it's on the compositions of Muthuswamy Dikshitar. That would be a very good starting point.
Great. So finally, tell us about GuruGuha Amritam and tell us how people can engage with it.
So GuruGuha Amrita is a movement that we started 14 years ago. And again, it's some divine coincidence, definitely, that the day we are recording it is the 14th anniversary of GuruGuha Amrita. So 2009 is where, in the same day that we are recording today, in November, is when we founded GuruGuha Amrita. So it's been a 14-year journey. And the goal was to have a platform where students, musicians, listeners, academicians can all just come and share the various dimensions to this composer, Muthuswamy Dikshitar, only. And we do various activities around the year. If you look at it on a calendar basis, the year begins with a musical homage and aradhana to Dikshitar at his Samadhi in Ettayapuram, which we conduct in March every year. That's also said to be the month of his birth, in and around the month of his birth, according to the Gregorian calendar. We conduct a global competition of Dikshitar Kritis, where year on year, close to 300 students all over the world participate. We just concluded our recent edition. And we encourage them to learn new compositions. We give out prizes for them to encourage them. We conduct workshops of Dikshitar's compositions. We conduct concerts by musicians, young and seasoned, around the year. We conduct lectures. And we end the year, in fact, a week from where we are, in fact, 2 days from where we are recording today, where we are doing a day with Dikshitar in Chennai, where we spend an entire day, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. here at Chennai, having with around 8 to 10 events, with each event highlighting a different aspect about Dikshitar.
Great. I hope someday we will do a tour of Dikshitar, of all these 3 places that you mentioned.
We should.
If I may just add, we should do a pilgrimage tour of these 3 places for maybe 5 days, 6 days.
We should.
Yeah.
If I may just add, I would encourage your listeners to tune into dikshitar.org, dikshitar.org, to learn more about GuruGuha Amrita and its activities and how they can engage with us, support us in various forms.
Right. We'll link up all that in the description of this. And thank you so much for taking us on a pilgrimage journey with Dikshitar, and learning a lot about how the poets react to a pilgrimage. or how the poets engage and leave a creation for the rest of us to follow. So thank you so much, and we will bring you back someday to understand more about other aspects or the deeper aspects of Dikshitar's work, his Sangeet Archana, as I understand this is. So thank you so much, Ravi.
Thank you for joining us on Detours. You can also join us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Our handle is IndiTales, IndiTales. See you soon.